Hi everybody, we're at 1:30, which by my clock means we should be due to start. First of all, can everybody hear me? Dennis, can you hear me? You can put a thumbs up in the camera and I'll know if you can.
Loud and clear.
Excellent. Hoping everybody else can as well. If you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, please do. I'm thinking I might make the intro slow for the first couple of minutes just to give people who are perhaps busy networking in the other room a chance to join us. So while we wait for them to do that, hello, thank you to those of you who have managed to get here on time and for choosing the change management room this afternoon. I think you had a few tough choices to make there looking at this afternoon's agenda. My name is Hannah Moffatt. I'm a writer and creative director at a language and behavioural science consultancy in the UK called Schwa. I'm going to be looking after you for the next hour or so, and I'm also going to be sharing a few of my thoughts on the words and phrases that can really help you engage your employees in times of change. But I'm also he's just turned his camera off, but I'm also delighted to introduce Dennis Martin Tolley Olsson, who is the Group Sustainability Change Lead at Danske Bank. And he's going to be sharing a really interesting case study with you this afternoon, looking at how you can harness the power of change that is already within your organisation to get a really great impact. Dennis is a change practitioner. He's been working in the financial sector for the last 16 years, and he spent 7 of them, I believe, sort of actively specialising in driving change for organisations. Now, if you were at a gig this evening, then Dennis would be described as the headline act, which basically means I'm going to be talking first, and you'll be hearing a bit more from Dennis in about 25 minutes or so. In terms of the tech for the event, the fact that you've all signed in is a good sign. I'm assuming that means things are working. But if you have any problems at any point, I believe if you type help and maybe describe your tech issue in the chat, somebody will come to help you. Other than that, I think we've decided to go fairly low-fi. So the format for this session is that I will do a short presentation for about 20 minutes. During that time, I won't be able to see if you put any comments or questions in chat, but Dennis will. So he's going to be keeping a close eye on those questions so that I can answer a few at the end. Then I will hand over to Dennis. He will also do a roughly 20 minutes or so case study presentation, and will be open to questions at the end. He also won't be able to see the questions while he's talking, but I will keep an eye on them. And then finally, at the very any time left, if any would as well and share any of your challenges or thoughts around change management with the group, then you'll be very welcome to do so. I think that was all the kind of housekeeping we needed to do. If anyone has any urgent questions about the format or anything they're worried about right now, do say in the chat. Otherwise, we'll get going. Now, the one technical bit that I'm really scared of is, will I be able to share my presentation? So we had a rehearsal a couple of days ago where we were told we should talk through everything that we're doing as we're doing it, so that you're not left out while I'm attempting to share my screen. So I believe I need to make sure that my PowerPoint is open, and it is. Then I need to go back to this window and see, it's not showing it as an application window. Yes, here we go. I bet you're really enjoying this step-by-step how somebody who's hopeless at tech gets a presentation started talk. I'm hoping that you can all see this. I'm going to trust that Dennis will come off mute and shout at me if nobody can see the slide, but you should be seeing in front of you magic words in times of change, which is what I'm going to be talking about, as I say, for the next sort of 15, 20 minutes. I should also say my company, Schwa, we actually have a booth here as part of the event, which is good. It means that I don't have to spend too long telling you about us now, because you can actually meet our founder, Jim, who is going to be in the booth answering questions. But just to give you a very quick summary of us, as I say, we're a language and behavioural science consultancy. We've been around since 2018, so quite young, but a lot of our core team actually have worked together for almost a decade now in other businesses. We are a team of writers, trainers and behavioural scientists. We help organisations to find their voice. We train them to help them write more effectively at work. And we solve tricky comms problems for people all over the world. And wherever we can, we love measuring those results as well. But to be honest, when people first meet us, there's really only one question they ask, and that is, what's Schwa? As in, what is a Schwa? What does that strange word that we've called ourselves mean? So if there are any linguistics nerds amongst you, you may have heard of the word before, because it is a linguistics term for the most common vowel sound in the English language, and that is the sound and you get it in all of these words here: the, mem, re, supply, and even hidden in words like rhythm. And we really like this word and this name because we think it sums up the two sides of what we do. So one, it talks to language and tone of voice and the sound and the feel of words, which all of the writers in the gang are about. But also, behavioural scientists like this as well, because there is an effect called the bizarreness effect, which says that if something is a little bit strange or out of the ordinary, you might be a bit more likely to remember it. And I love that we're called Schwa, because whenever we do events like this, I get to spend the first couple of minutes explaining what a Schwa means, which means that you will go away definitely having learnt something from my part of the session, and that really takes the pressure off for me. As for what's coming up in the next, it says 20 minutes, probably closer to 15 minutes now. I'm going to be looking at what I'm calling the magic words that will help make your people happier, help you get more done, and could even help you make more money, even during times of change. And when I share these words and phrases with you, some of them are going to sound quite simple, but it is amazing how often we forget to do those simple little things to engage our people. And it is also incredible what kind of results you can get just by making really small shifts in your language. But first, now I said that I'd taught you something, so the pressure was off me, but actually I'm now going to put the pressure back onto you. Because if you're in this session and you're dealing with change comms, I'm going to assume you're doing a lot of internal communication. And I don't know if any of you are followers of the Edelman Trust Barometer, but they put out a special COVID-19 edition of their survey this year, and they surveyed employees from across 10 different countries, asking who they went to for advice. And they found that you, as internal communicators, are more trusted than the government. So if you ever wondered, are people taking your messages seriously? I can tell you, as we're going through one of the biggest changes most organisations have ever had to face, actually, your employees are looking to you for advice and support. So just a little bit of pressure there. So now on to my magic words. I've said 3 magic words. I've kind of taken the word 3 quite loosely. It's 3 sort of terms or ideas. The first of which, very simple. Ask your people, how are you? And I don't mean a flippant, oh, hello, how are you, as you pass someone in the corridor. Well, if you're back in an office at the moment, we're still in lockdown in that sense in London. But a how are you where you're really listening for the answer and you're finding out how different people are feeling. And as I said, we're interested in behavioural science at Schwa. And the reason we think this how are you question is so important is because of an effect that can be summed up quite nicely in this illustration. Illustration, I should confess, I have stolen from the internet, so thank you, Google. There will always be someone who disagrees with you. That's not true. I've never disagreed with anyone. And this is a cartoon that sums up an effect called the false consensus effect. And it is the idea that we assume that the way that we are feeling is the way that other people are feeling as well. So if you've been communicating with your colleagues during the coronavirus, and you've been working from home and felt really quite happy and relaxed about it, you might forget that other people are living in a very different situation to you, and there might be people juggling all sorts of other priorities. So it is really important when you are writing messages during times of change to remember that your experience is unique to you and it's not necessarily shared by everybody else. So take a step back, put yourself in your employee's shoes. So the false consensus effect is one thing that can trip people up when they're messaging. The other is something that Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, here is a picture of him, describes as the curse of knowledge. And the curse of knowledge is the idea that the more you know about something, the harder it is for you to imagine other people not knowing those things. And this is something that we think often affects senior people in organisations who are communicating about strategies, changes of direction, because those people have been in all of the meetings leading up to the point where they're sharing that message. So they know the ins and the outs and the detail of the strategy, and they're really close to it. If any of you are sort of followers, can you follow a curve? Or know of things like the Kubler-Ross change curve? I always say that the leaders giving the change message are way further along that curve than the people hearing it. So this sort of ties back into that, not always thinking about how are other people feeling. So you need to remember, not everyone knows what you know, and not everyone feels how you feel. And bearing this in mind is going to help you to personalise your messages to colleagues. If, though, you forget both of these things, your change messages could end up sounding similar to the messages that came out from this chap, who some of you might recognise. This is Stephen Elop. He is one of the head honchos at Microsoft, and he made the news not in a very good way back in 2014, when he had a particularly difficult change message to deliver, and that was that he had to make a large number of the Nokia team redundant. And he decided to do this by email. I'm just going to share the email that he sent out to his colleagues on screen for you now. That's not all of it, by the way. So if you've looked at this and you've already gone, how long this email is, I should say it goes on for another 12 paragraphs. And if you just look at the beginning, I really don't expect you to read all of it. If you just look at that first paragraph there, Microsoft's strategy is focused on productivity and our desire to help people do more. As the Microsoft Devices Group, our role is to light up this strategy for people. We are the team creating the hardware that showcases the finest of Microsoft's digital work and digital life experiences. And we will be the confluence of the best of Microsoft's applications, operating systems, and cloud services. And ask yourself, if you had just had this email come to your inbox, would you read that and think, uh-oh, I'm losing my job here? But it sets up completely the wrong expectation for what is coming later in the email. And I do think here that Stephen has both been cursed with knowledge and had the false consensus effect hitting him. False consensus because for him, as somebody who is not losing his job, actually Microsoft's strategy and do more and the new direction is probably really important. Less important for the people who are not going to be working there. Similarly, for curse of knowledge, he knows that people are going to be made redundant, but so he's thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to tell the story in order and get to that point. Whereas for the people waiting for that news, they've had to wait until the 11th paragraph of a 1,000 word long email to just get 2 sentences telling them that they're losing their job. Not really the way you would want to hear the message. I should also point out, I don't work for Microsoft. I don't have any friends or family who work for Microsoft either. So the only reason I saw this message that should very much have been internal is because people reacted so badly to it that they were sharing it online and it was able to make the headlines, which is a reminder that there's really no such thing as completely internal comms. And if you get it wrong and you're not thinking about your reader, much greater chance that those messages could go public. So remember, not everyone knows what you know. Not everyone feels how you feel. And if you do have a tough change message to share, really, it's better for everyone if you get it. On to my next set of magic words, something feeling a little bit more positive, perhaps, than the redundancy message: we and us. Now, again, during lockdown, I think we've seen a lot more the use of we and us. We're all in this together, very positive, collective language. But I also saw a fascinating study in the MIT Sloan Management Review a few weeks ago, looking at how do employees want to be communicated with about changes in their organisation during the pandemic. And they tested out several different forms of communication, all coming from the CEO. So they tested sending emails and having videos, and they also tried doing those 3 times a week or once a week. And it turns out you can over communicate, and the people getting the messages 3 times a week actually ended up feeling a bit more anxious about what was going on. So once a week was preferable. And people also preferred and felt like they trusted their CEO more when the CEO was talking on camera rather than writing an email. But what I thought was really interesting, and it is why you are looking at the words we and us on screen now, is that regardless of whether the message was going out once a week, 3 times a week, on email or on video, people universally responded better to the CEO messaging talking about we rather than talking about I. So much so, in fact, that the data came in to say that employees felt 3.5 times more supported when they got that collective we messaging. And they didn't just feel more supported, they actually changed their own behaviour and were 5 times more likely to go on and support others as well. So to show you're all in it together, whether that be a pandemic or any other change in your organisation, using more we and less I is definitely the way to go. Although I would caveat this ever so slightly to say any pronoun is better than no pronoun. Because often when we have trickier messages to share, we find people tend to hide behind a particular grammatical construction and write sentences like this: mistakes were made, costs were cut, this needs to be done. And these are all sentences written in the passive voice. And it's the passive voice because you don't know who is doing the action. You don't know who is making the mistakes, who is cutting the costs, who needs to do the doing. And I've never been a fan, really, of the passive voice in change comms, partly because it sounds a bit evasive and sneaky. Like, mistakes were made. You can imagine a politician trying to weasel out of something and not really apologising properly, saying mistakes were made. But also it makes your message far less clear. Like, who is actually doing what here? So to make it much, much clearer, you can make each message active by putting the person doing the doing at the start. So you might have, I made a mistake, we need to cut costs, you need to do this. And perhaps that we still sounds the warmest of those 3, but I do think any pronoun better than none. So that's how you can own your message, is by bringing in the active voice. And then the final magic word, one that we should all be using, but it is amazing how often we forget, and that is to say thank you. And I think it's very easy to go, well, no, my colleagues know that I appreciate them. The team knows that I like what they're doing. But it never hurts to say it. It never hurts to reaffirm that message. And one thing I've absolutely loved during lockdown is looking on LinkedIn, looking at Twitter, and seeing people actually actively sharing the thank you messages they've had from their employers. Here are a couple of examples. So this is from a security alarm company. Thank you for making business as usual happen in the most unusual way. You are the most supportive, adaptable, trustworthy and outstanding colleagues. Also, I think the Kit Kat there is an added bonus. If people wanted to say thank you to me with a Kit Kat, I'd be pretty happy about it. But I like that this thanks is really grounded in something concrete, and you've got that corporate strategy there in shot as well. So you know that the thanks and what the company is aiming to do are really tied together to give you a sense of purpose. Another lovely example in the UK came from the NHS, writing not just to their employees, but actually to the children of their staff, and thanking them for letting their mums and dads spend that extra time at work, giving all that they could to fight the pandemic. And it's a really nice example of just remembering that your people are not numbered, they're not 9 to 5 and disappear, that they're human beings with a life outside of work as well. And I think a message like this just sums that up so beautifully. And especially if you actually look at the tweet at the top, this is the organisation I work for, a trust where 2 of our wonderful leaders send letters to the children of our staff, and no words to explain how proud I am. Isn't that the feeling we all want from our people? But actually, even outside of a pandemic, we know that saying thank you can be really effective. And one of my other favourite thank you studies comes from the University of Pennsylvania, where they were doing a phone campaign to try and get donations from former students. And they split the group of callers in half for the study. One half just came in, they had their script to follow, and they went off and did it. The other group had a pep talk at the start of the day from the head of fundraising, who was thanking them for their work and telling them just they were contribution they were making. You can probably guess which of the 2 groups was more effective. But at the end of the day, the group who had had that thank you pep talk made 50% more calls than the group who hadn't, and were 21% more profitable in terms of the amount of money they brought in. So saying thank you really does have a huge impact, not just on morale, but on the output that people give you. So what do you want to do in times of change, and all the time really? Connect your people to your purpose with a simple thank you. And I think you can even preemptively thank you as well. If you're launching a change, if you know things are going to be tricky, say thank you at the start. Behavioural scientists might even call that pre-commitment, getting people to already think, oh, well, I've already been thanked for this, so I better go on and work in this new way. So there you go. Here are our magic words. Quite simple things that perhaps you're going, oh, well, I do that already. If you do it already, brilliant. If you know you should do it already, but sometimes you forget, then I hope this has been a useful reminder with enough evidence to back it up. As I said, we actually have a booth here today. I don't want you to run off to the booth right now because we've got Dennis coming up in a second. But if you do head over and chat to Jim, our founder, later in the day, he might be able to tell you more about the virtual training we have on offer. And if you're one of the first people to the booth and you ask very nicely, we may even be able to give you a freebie taster session. You can also follow what we're up to more generally at Schwa UK. And you've got our email address, my email address and our website address on screen as well. I think we've just about done that in time. That was a bit of a whistle stop. So I'm now going to stop sharing and hope that this works and that we can see Dennis again. Okay. So in a moment, we'll hand over for Dennis to talk about his experiences within Danske Bank. But just to check, were there any questions in the session that are sort of burning questions to tackle now, or can I hand over straight to you, Dennis?
I think there's, can you hear me, Anna?
I can hear you.
Yeah, great. Great session. Thank you so much. Very inspirational. I did receive a question about, is it true that there's a value of communicating the same message on numerous times in order to create sort of the behavioral change that you want? Or is that sort of a myth? If you deliver, the communication message with a true impact, would that be enough?
Oh, that's a very good question. And there are arguments on both sides, I suppose, because actually in behavioral science, there's a theory called the mere exposure effect, which says that the more you are exposed to a message, the more you'll actually come to like it. So there is an advantage to getting that new strategy, that new idea out there more than once. I think the reason that the multiple messages weren't working so well in that specific kind of in a state of heightened anxiety already at the beginning of lockdown, and perhaps hearing about it so often just reminded them of the reasons why they should be anxious. So I think it doesn't work in those messages, and there once a week a reassuring message was better, but people still wanted to hear quite frequently, just not every other day. But yeah, there is definitely some value in repeating a message. If it's lengthy, perhaps not, but repeating the highlights so that people like them more.
Okay, great. Second one. So about the preferred sender of communication. So often we hear in theory that executive sponsor and direct managers are the preferred senders to create a behavioral impact. But is that also what you see from your experience?
Also, great question. And again, probably depends on the message, actually, that there are certainly times when having your CEO, having a senior sponsor behind a message is really helpful. And we find it so a lot of the biggest change programs we're involved with at Schwa will be trying to encourage an organization to write in a new way and to adopt a particular voice, as it were. And there, actually, if you don't have somebody senior saying, yes, I endorse this, there's often anxiety sort of lower down the ranks of people going, oh, well, I'd like to do this, but will my boss let me? So in those cases, it is good. But sometimes it's about picking the person who is most relevant as well. So who can most authentically talk about the message. So it might even be a new recruit. If you're looking at employee engagement and how do you onboard new starters, maybe it would be better to have somebody who's joined your organization quite recently of what it was like. So I think you should do this. So I think it's about choosing the person who can most authentically deliver the message. Often that is someone at the top, but not always. Shall we hand over to you, Dennis, to make sure you've got plenty of time for your presentation, and then we can always tackle a few other questions if there are any afterwards.
So then I'll just say thank you and use that magic word.
Yes, thank you. And I will mute myself.
Great. Okay, thanks, and hi everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this session on change management. And I will now start paddling as Hannah browse through the options of presenting my material here. Hopefully you'll be able to see it soon. Is it good, Hannah?
Yes, I can see it.
Great. Okay, cool. So yes, so my name is Dennis and I'm working in Danske Bank. And the session today, or my presentation today, is really a hands-on practical experience of my own, trying to drive the change agenda across Danske Bank on a group scale. And I labeled the presentation as harnessing the power of change. And as Hannah alluded to in the introduction, it's the already existing internal power of change that resides in the organization, but which is not just being utilized to the greatest extension as it possibly can. So during my presentation, I'll go through sort of this hands-on experience that I've had driving change in Danske Bank and how unraveling and leveraging existing best practices can boost collaboration, how aligning change expertise can help you develop a common language, but it also can reduce cost and efforts of change managers, and how that sort of initial sponsorship or that sponsor with a big bag of money isn't necessarily something that you should wait for in order to create impact, which we often hear in theories on change management, that the executive sponsorship is crucial in order to gain momentum and traction. So who's Danske Bank? Danske Bank, we are a Nordic bank, and we have been around for 145 years, helping people and businesses realizing their ambitions. We have approximately 22,000 employees, and we serve approximately 3 million personal, business, and institutional customers. And apart from traditional banking, we also offer life insurance, pension, wealth management, real estate, and leasing services. So looking at our organization, we are fairly big and a fairly complex organization already, with 3 million customers scattered across 220 branches, 13 countries, more than 22,000 employees. And when I joined Danske Bank for a bit more than 2 years ago, I started in a position as change manager that had the mandate to ensure that we were aligned and harmonized in our way of working with change management across the Nordic markets in personal banking. So an isolated part of the organization with a specific focus. And I think it didn't take me more than 2 to 3 weeks to realize when I engaged with my Nordic counterparts that each of them were actually using an individual framework. So already there was a misalignment and zero harmonization. So, and the individual frameworks obviously wasn't necessarily bad in any way. So I'm sure that they provided value and impact on their local projects. But when you are an organization of this size, you often get involved in cross-Nordic projects, right? So often you end up, serving and implementing initiatives that impact the same end users. And that's where the complexity arises. So if the end users, they are being faced with different terminologies, different tools, different templates, from each initiative, it gets very complicated and very complex for them to comprehend exactly what they need to do in order to adopt and use the implementation that we try to realize. And on top of this, I also realized that many of the local implementation team, often when they were faced with challenges and they didn't know whether they need to go to right or go to the left, they reach out not internally, but they reach out externally for consultancy help because they didn't really know who to reach out to internally because that sort of transparency wasn't there in the organization. So, it made sense. It was sort of a logic approach, but at least I saw that here there was a potential of realizing and harvesting the internal benefits and the internal expertise and the best practices in the organization, but was just not what, which just wasn't used for driving, you can say, the more cross-Nordic projects. And on top of this, just isolated in Denmark alone, we had more than 100 implementations a year. So of course, these varies in sizes, in terms of t-shirt sizes, but still 100 implementations a year, where often the same end users are the ones that we want to adopt and use. And as said, there wasn't any common language or common toolbox being used. And on top of this, we actually had quite many different change units. So units working specifically with a change management as their responsibility. And when I did a further analysis of sort of the organization, trying to identify which units do we have in the organization that has a day-to-day responsibility with change management, this is just sort of a glimpse of the entire stakeholder mapping. And the two teams that I've highlighted, called Change Team and the other one called Change Management, they resided in two of our biggest business units, and they had a similar mandate. But when I told them about, have you spoken to Meadow? Have you spoken to Louise from the other business unit? Each of them said, actually, you know what? I didn't even realize that they existed. So that sort of internal collaboration, which probably for many seems very natural and very logic, wasn't there. And that's because of the lack of transparency that wasn't available in the organization at that point in time. So, and when I did some sort of, sample testing in organization, say, all right, so if we have this complex framework landscape, and we assume that this is a challenge for our end users, so asking our go-to-market implementations team, so how often do you actually believe that we succeed in defining the behavioral change needed and embedded in our go-to-market efforts? So how often do we succeed in realizing the return on investment on our initiatives? The majority of people said, we believe that it's in less than 20% of the cases. So this started to build into somewhat of a burning platform where I can see that, all right, so here we have a business case where there is definitely a need for someone who needs to do something. So I I started looking into sort of the maturity across the organization and came to the conclusion that this seems to be at a very low level. There wasn't any aligned approach. So that's why I took the initiative to start building a community. So we could start, identifying those best practices of people actually creating impact with their way of working with change management, regardless of framework, but also to upskill colleagues. And now I included this saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And that was sort of the focus that I had, because I could see that whenever some of the change managers were facing a challenge, they were struggling with something and they didn't know what to do, they reach out to an external consultancy. And there's nothing wrong with external consultancies, so that's not my point here. But they reach out and they, got the fish served instead of trying to upskill their own competencies and trying to grasp the challenge themselves. So that was sort of my initial purpose with this initiative, that I wanted to teach the change managers how to fish, so that instead of being dependent and relying on someone else externally, they could tackle their challenges and the struggles themselves. But what I also realized that, even though the business case was quite evident and quite strong, and even though, the scope, the target group were change managers, change practitioners, and even though the topic was centered around exactly what they were doing, you couldn't just assume that they will be willingly to buy in from the get-go. So some of the first reactions that I received when I reached out to people, it was like, Dennis, listen, I got my, I'm fully covered. I know what I'm doing. The framework that I'm using is perfect. I'm creating a lot of impact, so I don't need you to change my way of working. So there was this sort of initial resistance coming from some of the stakeholders that I engaged with. And when I replied, said, listen, if you have a best practice example of gaining traction, delivering impact, making sure that our implementations are actually being adopted and used, then I want to scale that. I want that to be shown. I want that to be transparent to other like-minded practitioners across the group. And then they will start listening and getting more engaged and say, all right, well, great. Now I'm interested, and I'm willing to share, of course, with colleagues who find this interesting and relevant in their day-to-day job. So what I did was I identified an initial reference group to assess the need and the appetite of changing our way of working, but also to do sort of a sample testing of how aligned our perception of change was. So I did a few workshops, and there it already became quite evident that even though we are working with similar responsibilities in the bank, our perception and our understanding, our language of how we interpreted change was quite different. So people could see that there was a potential in maturing that common language to a further extent. So we established a short-term and long-term focus of the community. Short-term, very practical, very hands-on. It's just about connecting people. It's just about making sure that it's transparent in the organization who you can reach out to if you have a question about A, B, and C. So, building that sort of initial common language, and also just to reduce save the cost of the organization of not always going external, but rather trying to have an internal approach and see, if there are any colleagues that could support and benefit with their expertise on your specific challenge. And then long term, it's about building that some common language and that group guide of how we deal with change management in Danske Bank, so that our go-to-market initiatives, our go-to-organization initiatives, we can harvest the ROI on a much larger scale, and we can support our sponsors, leaders, and project managers and end users to a further greater extent. So at that point in time, there wasn't anything that was called COVID or Corona, and there wasn't really that high focus on virtual collaboration tools. So at that point in time, I didn't really have any tools available that could support on a group-wide scale. So we didn't really have Teams. We do now after the Corona, but at that point in time, we didn't have any group-wide collaboration tools that really could support sort of community. So I did a really MVP solution. I created a SharePoint site in which people, they could sign up, people they could enlist in a sort of a sparring panel if they believe that their expertise on a specific field, for instance, change communication or behavioral design, and they would like to share that expertise with other parts in the organization. So we started building sort of a catalog of internal consultants on specific areas that people they could reach out to if they were being challenged on their local projects. So it was about upskilling existing colleagues' competences. It was about reducing costs for the bank in terms of external consultancies, and it was about building that initial common language and maturing that effort. And after some iterations, the community grew in size, and people they started identifying themes or sub-disciplines of the change management discipline that they thought were evident and important to have as a part of a holistic toolbox. So these are well known, I believe, in the change management community. But change communication, leadership, behavioral design, learning journey, and benefit realizations are the disciplines that the community currently has identified as something that they believe will have a great impact if being part of a holistic toolbox. And it's based on those sub-disciplines that then we have created different expert panels or sparring panels, so people they can reach out to, colleagues from residing in the organization. And we have done a few physical community sessions. Right now we have approximately 180 colleagues that's part of the community in Danske Bank. But at the community kickoff, I decided that we want to present the best practices, cases, or examples that we have in the organization on each of the different disciplines that have been identified by the community as something that is a need to have in order to deliver impact. So I identified, the front runners in the organization, people that actually have showed an impact and that they have been able to create value with this specific subdiscipline. And they came to the community kickoff and they presented their way of working. And then for each of the presentation, the community was asked to do an impact and alignment assessment. So impact, do they believe that what they've just seen and heard and being presented by a colleague will create impact in their part of the organization? And in terms of alignment, do they believe that what they know, for instance, on benefit management is aligned with what they have just seen and being presented by a colleague? Or are we far from in terms of frameworks and methodologies being used? And I think the positive thing was to hear that in general, on an impact level, everyone agreed that there was a high impact and it will be benefiting them in their part of the organization. And where we needed to put our efforts into was on the alignment part. But of course, that was to no surprise because that was sort of my initial findings when I did the stakeholder analysis across Danske Bank, that we were very misaligned in our way of working. But a very good exercise that provided sort of a good foundation for the further work. And just shortly after, I think, not more than a month or 2 months after, we already saw the first short-term proof points being materialized at different levels in the organization. So the one colleague coming and presenting their way of working with change leadership provided inspiration for other colleagues who were about to plan and execute on leader conferences in their specific business unit and group functions. So already there we saw an alignment in language, because out of these 3 to 4 leaders conferences in some of our largest business units in the organization, all leaders were presented to a common language. Whereas previously, each of the business units had been working more or less in silos and reaching out to external consultancies for help and guidance. But now we started to see that sort of first proof point of utilizing the existing best practices. And we started establishing behavioral design intro courses for everyone who would be interested in Danske Bank. We saw that the change management framework started getting integrated into the implementation model of our go-to-market teams. And we saw the L3 leaders started integrating change frameworks into their performance agreements when they were introduced this during the leader conferences. And we have also started to develop a group-wide change leadership learning program, all built on the existing best practices being used in the change community. And the long-term goal of building this group change guide has also slowly begun to materialize. So but I think the unique thing about this is a 5-step process, right? Like we know from many other change frameworks. But the unique thing about this is that it's built upon what we have already been using in Danske Bank. So we have 5 steps that we call make it real, make it easy, make it ready, make it happen, and make it stick. And make it real. For instance, this is a lot about the benefit realization process, that we map out the key behavioral indicators of what we try to realize and achieve. Make it easy, for instance, is about behavioral design. So how can we create easy to use, intuitive solution that makes it less comprehensive for the end users to adopt and use, and so forth. And it's something, where we consistently iterate on developing the content and so forth. But at least it's a quite unique thing that this is based on the expertise in Danske Bank. So practical learnings from my experience working with this process in Danske Bank since I started, is that creating a network and a community with a shared goal and a shared purpose really can help boost your change maturity forward. So when people, come together and they align on, for instance, change management or project management or communication, etc., they often have similar needs. They often have similar challenges. And that sort of expertise and experiences coming from different parts of the organization really can help boost the collaboration across an organization. Exactly to that point, unraveling those existing best practices can help solve those immediate organizational needs, like, for instance, with the leadership conferences. Whereas we would have spent a lot more money normally, and we would have spent a lot more time on developing content, but in the end, content that would only be useful in that part of the organization, in that part of the specific business unit. But now, on the other hand, when leaders, they come together across the organization from these business units and they tell about their experience with the change frameworks being introduced during the leaders conferences, they can say, really, that's exactly what we also heard. So now they can have sparring and they can come together on a different level than what they will be able to before. And then, as said, I did this without anyone asking me to do it. I didn't have any executive sponsoring saying, Dennis, our change management maturity is really bad. You need to fix it. There wasn't anyone giving me any money or anything. So everything was done with an MVP approach, and now we have a set as 180 or 200 community members that are actively engaging with one another and sharing ideas and sharing best practices. So I think that's just a lesson learned, that what we often hear in change management theories is that one executive sponsor is crucial for your projects to be delivered with an impact and value creation. And this is just a practical example of that is not necessarily the case always. And that was really what I wanted to share with you. So I hope that was creative value and gave you some inspiration. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Dennis. That was brilliant. It's so fascinating. I love sort of getting into seeing something in practice and how you're managing to change an organisation of the size of Danske Bank as well, and sort of breaking down those silos. Absolutely fascinating. You might be able to see it now in the chat as well, actually, but the first two questions just came in the last couple of minutes. I think everyone was too busy concentrating to ask them earlier. So the first one here is from Andy. What was or were the projects that gave you the most impact and inspiration for this presentation?
Well, I think there was two, probably the leaders conferences, because the target group was so massive. I mean, we were talking about leaders conferences impacting 300 to 400 leaders in each business unit. So that was a massive impact on them further conveying the message about the utilization of change management towards their part of the organization. So I think there we saw a huge ripple effect of this exercise. And then I think also the fact that our go-to-market team also realized that there was something missing in their equation, or missing in their implementation model. So the fact that we were just delivering implementations without really, getting the end users to adopt and use the framework was also an eye-opener for them. So I think that's sort of an external and an internal perspective of two of the greatest examples that I believe we have realized.
Fab, thank you. And then moving on from that, Paul asks, how long did it take you to start realizing the early benefits of the work you've been doing?
I think a a few weeks. I think after I created that very simple SharePoint site and communicated that to the reference group. Again, there was an immediate ripple effect. People were spreading the words, and I could see that I had sort of put a notification on the SharePoint site that every time someone was signing up, I would get a notification, and in the first week or 2 weeks, my inbox was flooded with SharePoint notifications. So clearly there was a need for people to have this sort of collaboration platform and being able to reach out to their colleagues. And I heard numerous cases of people actually collaborating on different projects and exactly reaching out to one another. So I think that was sort of the short-term ambition, or the short-term goal with this community, was just to make people to reach out to each other, whether via mail or phone. It doesn't really matter. But if you have a challenge, look into the community and ask people for guidance. Probably there's a colleague that can help you. And I think those were the early benefits, which I think are the most important benefits.
Yeah. Oh, Paul's also added, you can probably see that being flooded is much better than deadly silence.
Yeah, absolutely. No. So yes, agree, Paul.
Definite validation that the approach is working.
Yes.
So I loved your quote earlier. I'm sure people have seen it before, the teach a man to fish quote. And it seems like a lot of the learning was listen to your colleagues, they might have the answer already. Did you have any other tips for anyone out there who wants to teach their own people to fish?
Yeah, but I think it's also about acknowledging whether you believe having a common language does make an impact and does create value, right? Because I think that if we look at the Nordics, if we look at the financial institution in the Nordics, where I'm residing, I think the maturity of change management could be at a higher level. But as compared to the US, as far as I understand, we see that central change functions are established to sort of ensure that governance and ensure that way of working across the organization. But it's a topic that's always up for discussion whether it creates impact or it doesn't. So there is a huge amount of effort that needs to be built into creating a common language of change management, because you won't be guaranteed to have that executive sponsor who says, we need to have this full scale across the organization from the get-go. So it's often something, from my experience, as a grassroots exercise, and that requires a lot of effort. Because if someone is not asking you to do this, and you're not being measured on it, and it's not part of your performance agreement, then it's something you do voluntarily, which was the case in my situation. So I spent a lot of my spare time working on this, but because I believe that it created value for the organization as a whole.
Which I think is also answering Andy's follow-up question of how do you motivate yourself to do this? So the full question, giving a man a fish requires less energy as opposed to teach a man how to fish. How did you motivate yourself on choosing the latter? So you've sort of touched on, well, it's what you believed in the pep talks you were giving yourself.
Yeah, at least in my case, if how that's the question is to be interpreted, is that I obviously I believe as a practitioner, I believe in the methodologies and the impact of change management. I've seen it myself. I have hands-on experiences working with a structured way of dealing with change management and how that can create value for employees, leaders, and sponsors, and so forth. So of course, I have that sort of experience in my backpack. And that's sort of what just kept me engaged in this whole exercise, that I believe that people, they could, upskill their competences to a great extent, and they could have greater success with their projects, and they could also, share their burdens, share their failures with like-minded practitioners, which is always a good way of just letting out air. And you're not alone in the world. Other people have faced the same challenges like you. So I think, I don't know whether that answered the question, but at least that was sort of the motivation from my point of view.
Unless Andy says otherwise, I think that answered the question. We've got questions on measurement and targets here as well. What type of targets or goals did you set yourself to track progress, other than inundated inbox?
Right. So that's a good question. First off, from the very, very beginning, it was just to see, was there an interest of people signing up? Could people see, did people share the same need for alignment and for collaborating on the topic of change management, or were they completely satisfied with just working on their own local projects with their own local frameworks? So that was sort of the initial traction or targets to see whether this makes sense and this created value in the organization. But then also, how many people were actually reaching out to one another and sharing those best practices, and how many people were using the best practices being shared at the community kickoff. So did we see an impact of people starting, utilizing what they have listened, what they have been heard? Or was it just another physical event where people just went off and continued with their own same behavior, working with their own same methodologies, regardless of what they've just been told at the community kickoff? So I believe that we already see now that on the presentation from the community kickoff, those best practices being shared has also been utilized in the other parts of the organization. For instance, the change leadership with the leadership conferences. Their framework, their methodology was copied more or less to the leaders conferences. So that's sort of the tracking that I'm measuring on.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it seems like actually is a very measurable thing. So who's reading the messages? Because these conferences are so visible, it's easy to see if people are following the same formats or not.
Yeah.
Now, we do have some people at the bottom who may or may not want to come up on screen with us, although Edith and Frank, you have both been there from the beginning. So I'm not sure if that was an accident at the start and that you were just saying hello, or if you have a question. So maybe if Edith and Frank, if you're still here, type yes in chat if you would like to come up and be on camera. And if I get a no or I get nothing, I'm going to assume that might have been a mistake at the start. Jim is actually from Schwa, so I think was perhaps also just looking in at the beginning. And so, Jim, if you're still there, don't be offended if I move on to Patricia, who has very recently popped up as somebody who might want to come on screen. So, Patricia, if you're there and you have clicked that deliberately and would like to be on screen and ask a question, type yes in the chat. I'm just sort of scared of pulling people up on camera if it was a mistake. And then they're there in pajamas going, oh no, hang on.
Yeah, we did have a tech rehearsal a few days ago, but we're not that comfortable with the platform yet. No.
Yeah, and we've heard if you come on by accident, there is a risk you could stay on all day and then people might just see you cooking your dinner, which you probably don't want. So yeah, Patricia, if you are there and you have a question, just write something, anything in the chat box to confirm that you would in fact like your camera on. And the same for anybody else. If you would like to join in the panel, which means you can actually speak and be on camera. We've only got a couple of minutes, but I've heard that we don't get an automatic shut off. So if you do have a question you haven't asked yet, that is an option.
Yeah.
Listen, I really like what you were saying about common language as well. Obviously, the word nerd is like, oh, it's talking about language. This is exciting. I mean, how did you go about defining what that common language should be? What did it look like?
Well, it didn't look like anything from the beginning. I said that I don't want to decide exactly what the common language is in Danske Bank. That's what we're going to realize based on the best practices that we unravel in the organization. So let's that be the sort of the building blocks in terms of the common language in Danske Bank. So it becomes unique based on all the experiences and learnings in the organization. So that's what we are slowly materializing now in a common language framework, which is a big task because working more and more in these agile worlds, you don't want to have this big comprehensive methodology framework that's not really adaptable to smaller iterations or smaller implementations. So it's about finding the right balance of what to use in in a lengthier project, but also being able to downsize it and make that more impactful for smaller projects with a smaller timeline. So I think that's always the challenge with the change management framework methodologies in general.
Fab. Sorry, I got distracted because I suddenly saw quite more questions rushing in for the last minute. What's the next challenge? Is the quick one to answer, perhaps?
This is a grassroots community. So people they are joining this because they have a need. And as said, we didn't need that executive sponsor in order to gain traction and to create impact. But of course, if we had our CEO saying, we need to have change management integrated in the way that we operate our business, that of course will be able to speed up the process and will make sure that that the framework is getting the attention that is needed across the group without having to persuade or to talk people into it, right? So obviously having our CEO supporting this would be a great support. And I think in the long term, if we want this to be sustainable in the way that we operate our business, there probably will be a need for some sort of sponsorship to make it sustainable. So it's not only driven by people who believe that this has an impact and this has a purpose, but who can actually dedicate their full time and an investment in it as part of their day-to-day jobs. So I guess that's sort of the overall challenge or main challenge.
Maybe your CEO and the senior people who could be in the running for senior sponsor need the copy of the recording from today, so they can see the impact you're already making and want to get behind it. There's an add-on to that question, then Andy will do yours quickly as well after that. So, I mean, you created the platform to share best practice, but you keep people busy on improving. So, is that a day-to-day task, getting the group to refine things? And if so, how are you doing that?
So there isn't any expectations of improving. So people and maybe I'm getting the question wrong, but there isn't any expectation set for people to improve. People, if dependent on their specific role and their specific challenges, people they are able to tap in to those existing best practices and to reach out to colleagues who have experience in tackling those challenges. And whether they want to upskill their competencies or whether they will continue to be served the fish instead of learn how to fish themselves, that is completely up to them. So that's sort of an individual approach that people they can decide on themselves depending on their capacity and whether they just want a quick fix or whether they want to invest this more into this for own personal reasons. So I'm not sure if that was answering to the question, but.
So really, the improvement is just continual, as long as
absolutely. So that
teams.
Yes, exactly.
I can see Arnold, but there was a question before. Oh, Julie, here we go. Actually, you sort of touched on this with your wanting to get some senior sponsorship, but just in case you have anything else to add from Andy, my experiences in supporting communicating a change is to find ambassadors that you can use or influence to relay your messages to others and to elevate the message. What's your experience regarding this approach? So have you approached the CEO yet for help or those potential senior sponsors?
Well, I think one example of ambassadors, absolutely, yes. For all the initiatives that I'm running, I'm also finding those reference groups or ambassador groups like I did in this case. So in order to be the voice of the movement and be the voice of the change. So it's not just coming from Dennis, who most people in the organization doesn't know, but it's coming directly from people that they can relate to or they have a working relationship with. So absolutely. And I think that also with the leaders conferences, obviously the content of those leaders conferences needed to be signed off by people from our executive leadership team, because they were the one going to stand and advocate for this approach of working with change management towards all of their leaders. So there you can say there has already been that initial buy-in from executive level point of view. But then taking that next approach of saying that our CEO is then going to say that we need to invest money, we need to invest time and resources in making this a full-scale solution. We still have some way to go, and I think also in light of Corona and all those implications that it's had on cost and resources, maybe the time is not now. So we will continue on our grassroots level, but maybe the time is right. But that's a very individual thing, and but no, I haven't had that discussion with our CEO.
Wow. I mean, in whether the time is right, it's certainly a good time for learning and changing the way people do things. So maybe everyone is sort of primed and ready to take on new ways of working at the moment, just because they've been doing it.
No, but I've seen. I think that in terms of Danske Bank, I've seen that the focus and the attention of change management as a discipline that can help support and drive more impactful changes has actually grown over time, and that could be due to many different reasons. So that's not something that I want to take credit for, but at least that there is a higher attention from a more senior level in the organization of investing time and resources in practitioners. So for instance, I just joined and to support our sustainability agenda across the bank 1.5 months ago, because the senior member from our executive leadership team said that we need that sort of resource, we need that sort of help. So I think that we can see that the attention is growing, and people, they are becoming more and more aware of the importance of change.
And I think we should give you some of the credit for that. It feels like you're being modest. So, people. And then should we take this one last question from Arnold, perhaps before wrapping up? Have you still got time, Dennis?
Yeah, sure.
So the final question was, did I understand that the agile framework and methodology you were handed was not agile enough? If so, how come? That's what you were talking about at the start of the presentation.
Yeah. So if I look at the current state of our sort of group change guide with the 5 steps that I showed you, make it real, make it easy, and make it happen, I would say the entire framework of all its components and building blocks is not fitted for a super agile delivery. That's where you need to pick and choose the elements that create value for that specific project. So, there are elements in the framework that definitely is usable and creates value in an agile context. But the entire framework as such, if I present this to someone working in our agile transformation team and saying, this is what you need to do in terms of change management, they would say, oh, Jesus Christ, I mean, are you serious? We don't have time to make that sort of grand scheme plan and with a timeline and everything. We need something that create impact here and now. We are doing continuous improvements, iterations towards our front line. So we just need them to be ready in order to adopt and use. And that's where that you need to pick and choose the elements from the framework that makes sense and creates value. And so there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, at least not yet, in terms of making a waterfall and an agile approach. I don't know whether that answers your question, Arnold, but hopefully to some extent.
I love the framework, just from a language perspective, like make it real, make it happen, make it stick. Love the energy of it, and it feels sort of very clear what you have to do at each stage as well. Oh, I think Arnu was actually asked to come up on stage. So, okay. I mean, I suppose unless Victoria, if you're watching, if you're saying, no, everyone's got to leave and go to a different session, then tell me that and I will say no. But otherwise, should we let Arnu up quickly? Oh, he's gone.
Oh, okay.
Maybe it was a mistake. Oh, well, no, he's on.
Yes. So you're now fishing for somebody to get on stage. So I thought I might thank you for answering my question just live and face to face. So thank you very much for that. But it's interesting that it seems that this framework, let's call it the Agile framework, or the things you got handed to you, that the change strategy behind it is opposite to what you try to achieve. Which is quick and easy ways to get small groups of people to change whatever they need right now. And agile, it means flexibility and easy to change. So it was also it put a bit of a smile on my face when you said, if I give it to anybody, they will think, whoa, this is way too much. So
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so the question I have, because you said, well, what we do I call it cherry picking. So we take the good things out of it.
Yeah.
But that's also a danger, because if you want to do it for the long run, it needs to be a system and not just individual tools. Or so how are you going to assure that it becomes a way of working in your organization and not just bits and pieces that people can use?
Yeah, but that's a good question, and I think also that comes down to sort of the sponsorship, right? So if it's something a grassroots community is saying that we're doing this and we are cherry picking of what we think makes sense, and no one is really saying, this is the way we need to do things. This is how we need to integrate into our way of operating our business. Then that's a sort of a constant challenge and a constant struggle between someone from a practitioner point of view facing that with a sponsor, an executive sponsor. And but we do actually have a group-wide agile transformation program. I guess most organizations do, but we do as well. And they are part of the community, and they are trying to grasp exactly, because they're trying to create a new way of working, or a better way of working, as we call it. And they're trying to see how can we implement the change elements into that way of working. And here we have sort of an iteration process based on the framework that we have now, and trying to see exactly the cherry picking. And I think that once we have had those several iterations based on the framework, based on the best practices that has been shared in the organization, that is sort of has the full overview of all the different sub-disciplines that I showed you. Once we realize exactly which of these components can create immediate value in an agile context, I believe that this is going to be the framework going forward. So this is still a process that is being materialized, and it's still a process that is ongoing. But I think that we have the right people involved with the right focus and with the right mindset. And if it becomes integrated into the better ways of working stream, there we already have a full sponsorship commitment. And then that will create sort of the way of working going forward. So it's not yet defined and decided, but it's in the making.
Okay, great. So it seems like you're in the discovery phase. Can I say that?
You could say that. Yeah, exactly. Because I think the short-term ambition with this, it was really just to connect people, and then the long-term ambition is still to create that sort of common framework and common language. So yes, we are still in a discovery phase.
Okay. Well, I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Anand, and thank you for your question.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
You can kick me off.
Thank you for being.
If you like, you can kick me off. If you like me on stage, I will stay here. So.
I think we've been told we're supposed to click people off, because otherwise you can pop up in everybody else's presentations.
Exactly.
And I'm sure you're just to be on the safe side.
Yeah,
Thanks very
thank
much.
you too.
There we go. I think we've done that. Super. Well, we've gone a little bit over time. Thank you to the 13 people who have stayed on and carried on listening to us rather than disappearing off to one of the other sessions. But I think we will wrap up now, if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
as well,
absolutely.
Dennis?
Yes. And thank you for all the questions.
Yeah, brilliant questions from everybody. So thanks so much for choosing our session this afternoon. Hope you found it useful. Certainly from Schwa's side, head off to our booth if you want to find out more about some free training. Dennis, I don't know if you want people to get in touch with you if they've got any other questions.
Feel free to reach out. I don't have a booth, but feel free to reach out.
Fab. And on that, I think we will leave the session, which means that you can all go off and join some other networking or other sessions happening now. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.